In this video, we're going to talk about the atmospheric requirements for the growth of microorganisms. You may think, well, everything uses oxygen for growth, but we're actually going to find with microorganisms that that's not the case. Many microorganisms do use oxygen. In fact, it's preferred by them, but there are some that don't. And the reason why these organisms do require or prefer oxygen is that in the metabolism of carbohydrate sources, they're going to take electrons and they're going to put them onto oxygen and in the process make water. In doing that, they're going to be making ATP, which is the molecule of energy for most living organisms. But one thing that they have to worry about is these oxygen metabolites can be very deadly, in fact. I have circled here oxygen. This is what we breathe in. We think of this as being good. We need that. Their microorganisms need that in their cells to carry out their metabolism. But sometimes oxygen gets a little selfish and steals electrons from other places, from other organic material, and we end up with these things that we call oxygen metabolites, superoxide anion, which has an extra electron, or a peroxide, which has a couple of extra electrons, that sort of thing. When they have these extra electrons, they can do a lot of damage to organic material. They can mess up your DNA, they can mess up proteins, and when I say they can mess up yours, yes, they can do that, but think about it for microorganisms. They have a single cell, and we start messing things up inside them, and it's going to be lethal. With us, we can neutralize that and not have as much problem. But these microorganisms are going to have to find a way to neutralize it or have to protect themselves from the oxygen. And we're going to be talking about that. What scientists have done is they've categorized bacteria based upon their oxygen usage. And the terms that we use, and we're going to discuss these in a little more detail, are obligate aerobe, facultative anaerobe, microaerophile, and obligate anaerobe. And each of these images here represents one of these. And we're going to talk about those in more detail, and so these pictures will make a little more sense when we get through this conversation. So obligate aerobes, obligate means there's an absolute necessity. Aerobe means oxygen. And we show you this image or this diagram of a particular nutrient broth that's called thioglycolate broth that only allows oxygen to diffuse down a little bit into the broth. So down here at the bottom of the tube, there's absolutely no oxygen at all. Up here at the top is where most of it is. And so an obligate aerobe is going to be growing up here at the top where it can get oxygen. It's going to be the thickest at the top, and then you'll get a little bit of growth only as far down as the oxygen is sufficient for the growth of the organism. And so those are the ones that actually require it for their metabolism. And there's plenty of organisms that's the case. So in order to protect them from those toxic metabolites I was showing you on the previous slide, they have two enzymes that are responsible for dealing with those metabolites. One's called superoxide dismutase, and the other one's called catalase. I'm going to talk about that in the next slide. But we find these two enzymes in most fungi, protozoa, and the bacteria that are obligate aerobes. So superoxide dismutase will take things like this oxygen 2- anion, which I'm going to call bad stuff because that's going to do a lot of damage, and then it converts it by adding protons to it to hydrogen peroxide. Now hydrogen peroxide is not much better. It can do a lot of damage to microbial organisms as well. So they have a second enzyme called catalase, and here you can see the hydrogen peroxide that's here is in this equation down here, and catalase is going to convert this from hydrogen peroxide to water and oxygen. And here we don't have extra electrons. They've been put onto the other compound to give you water. And so now the organism has neutralized it. And that's a good thing for them. Now, there are other groups of organisms that we call facultative anaerobes. And they don't require oxygen for metabolism, But if they have it, they really, really prefer it because it's more efficient. They make much more ATP in the presence of oxygen. You take away the oxygen, they convert the metabolism, they can still make ATP, but they're not going to make nearly as much. And so they'll undergo this anaerobic respiration, or sometimes they'll undergo fermentation, whatever it is that they need to do. They're still going to possess those two enzymes that are going to protect them, but they have this added luxury of being able to grow in a number of different places. And a good example of these are the gram-negative pathogens. So in our intestinal tract, we have bacteria that are facultative anaerobes because we have a lot of bacteria in our intestinal tract. The oxygen content is very, very low. And so we have those organisms that can grow in that kind of an environment. And the bad ones are the pathogens that can do this. And I have given you this question here. If they have a choice, which one are they going to choose? They're going to choose an oxygenated environment because that's where they're going to make their ATP. But they don't always have a choice. When they get, like I said, in your intestinal tract, they're not going to have a choice, so they're going to convert their metabolism so they can continue to grow. Now, another group is called microaerophile, and if you look at it, micro means small, aerophile means it likes air, but it likes a small amount of air, not quite as much as the facultative anaerobes or the aerobes use, but they still need some. And so if we're trying to grow these in the lab, we usually have to supplement their environment with carbon dioxide to replace some of the oxygen to keep it low. And there actually happens to be some pathogens in that group. Campylobacter jejuni and Helicobacter pylori are two examples. Campylobacter jejuni is a pathogen that's one of the organisms responsible for diarrhea. We find it in water and sometimes in food. And Helicobacter pylori is the organism that causes stomach ulcers. And they require less oxygen than many of the other organisms. And then the last group we get to is called obligate anaerobes. Again, obligate means an absolute necessity. Aerobes mean air, but in science we add this prefix "an" and it means not. So they have an absolute necessity for not having air. So they don't use oxygen for metabolism. They don't have the enzymes to protect themselves. So oxygen can be very lethal to them if it turns into one of those radicals, or the metabolites as I was calling them. And then that's going to kill the organisms. And you can use high levels of oxygen to get rid of some of these organisms. A good example is Clostridium, the genus Clostridium. And you think that may not mean anything to you, but many of you may have heard of C. diff as being an issue in hospitals and in nursing homes. And you've probably heard of botulism. That's another organism that's in the genus Clostridium. Also tetanus. These are all organisms that do not like oxygen. They'll die in the presence. And what they do is they're going to produce a structure called an endospore that's going to put them in a state of hibernation, so to speak, that helps protect them from oxygen. And then they wait till they get into an environment where there's no oxygen, and then they start growing like a normal cell. And most of those are producing toxins that harm your body. I threw this slide in here because it's kind of interesting working with anaerobes in the lab. They show this isn't an accurate picture, because most of the time when you're working in this kind of a situation, you'd actually have this black part would extend over your hands as in gloves, because you don't want oxygen to get in here. In fact, in some places they're using hydrogen gas. And they do all of their work in these anaerobic hoods. You have a little chamber that they're put into. You evacuate the chamber with the air, pump in whatever atmosphere. It could be nitrogen, which is less of an issue than using hydrogen gas. And then you work with it. Your incubator's in there. Or you can put it into what's called an anaerobe jar. We have these little gas packs. We add water. It produces carbon dioxide and hydrogen gas, and the hydrogen gas reacts with the oxygen to produce water, thereby getting rid of the oxygen and creating the anaerobic environment. This was that thioglycolate broth I was talking about. Here we have the aerobes. You can see the growth up here at the very top. The rest of it is fairly clear. Then we have the facultative anaerobes. There can be differences in the different organisms. This one, you see a fair amount of growth up here at the top and not quite so much down here. And in this one, we see growth going all the way throughout. And then this very last one, you don't see any growth here at the top where all the oxygen is, but you see growth in the rest of the tube where the oxygen is lacking. And so that's where we would find the obligate anaerobes growing. So this is kind of a useful tube if you're working, or media, if you're working with an organism and you want to know something about its metabolism. So kind of as a summary, we have aerobe, which means it's using oxygen. We have facultative anaerobe, which means it either uses oxygen or it can grow without it. That's why I have the X over the. We have the anaerobe, which absolutely cannot grow in the presence of oxygen. And then we have the microaerophile that you need just a tiny bit of oxygen, is represented by the small canister here.